Oui, alors vous avez déjà dit que je vais parler dans mon langage de travail, qui est l'anglais, mais je suis vraiment prête à prendre les questions en français. First of all, I would like to thank Alain Prochiantz for the invitation to this very stimulating event, which provides a broad range of insights to me, not the least what Alain introduced this morning as a specific French philosophy of biology. The continuing referral to the work of Claude Bernard inside and outside biological research indicates to me that his work remains salient in several ways. I would like to use the scientific approach for the analysis of the living system established and elaborated by Claude Bernard as an important testing ground to reflect upon the development of today's biological research. I will compare the conceptual transformation of the field of physiology initiated through the work of Claude Bernard to the current development of the field of neurobiology. I propose that currently neurobiology is undergoing a conceptual transformation comparable in scale and scope to that of the field of physiology at the turn of the 19th century. In this context, I'm particularly interested to understand the role of concepts in the concepts of physiology, milieu intérieur, and embryogenesis silencieuse on the one hand, and plasticity as a central concept of neurobiology on the other hand, have played in these transformations. For my presentation, I will focus on two interrelated themes. First, I will discuss how the relationship between the empirical and the theoretical introduced by Claude Bernard remains of relevance for the advancement of biological research also today. In other words, how it guides research in such a manner that novel insights can gain relevance, furthering the understanding of the living systems. Second, I will present some ideas on how embryogenesis silencieuse and plasticity capture each in their particular but related manner the dynamic nature of the adult organism. As a starting point, I would like to outline the hypothesis that I pursue in my own work on plasticity. I propose that a profound transformation of neurobiology is taking place, which has begun during the second half of the 20th century and continues into the present. At the center of this development, I place plasticity as a concept of adaptation based on functional and structural change of the nervous system. I argue that as a consequence and interrelated with the diversification and differentiation of the concept of plasticity in a variety of empirical contexts, the predominant view of the adult nervous system as immutable and constant, which has been established during the first half of the 20th century, has been largely abolished. It has been replaced by the understanding of a nervous system that remains lifelong, changeable, and therefore adaptive to novel demands. This novel understanding has different ramifications on an empirical as well as on a theoretical level. So in both fields, physiology and neurobiology, we have observed and are observing the establishment of a novel scientific approach to the analysis of the adult organism. In one case, it has been credited mainly to one very visible scientist, namely Claude Bernard. In the other case, that of plasticity, I consider it as the result of the work of many different scientists in different domains of neurobiology. Some of these scientists were more visible, some less. In this context, I would like to emphasize the continuous and persistent nature of scientific change rather than the sudden realization of a novel science. In neurobiological research, you can observe how during the second half of the 20th century, through the work first of individual laboratories, then of an increasing number of scientists, the proof of a lifelong dynamic and adaptive nervous system accumulate, and with that contribute to and constitute a novel understanding. It goes without saying that these developments have sometimes been very protracted and the debates accompanying them quite controversial. When I was reading Claude Bernard, La Révolution physiologique by Alain Prochiantz, I found a number of references to Claude Bernard's work illustrating very well the understanding Bernard had of the relationship between the empirical and the theoretical in everyday laboratory research. As much as Claude Bernard seemed aware of the limitations of providing theoretical frameworks for explaining biological process, he was also aware of the necessity for research to progress. This quote by Alain Prochiantz in his book, Ni dogme théorique, ni dictature du fait brut, captures very nicely the tension between the empirical and the conceptual in the work of Claude Bernard, and as I would like to argue also in your biological research of today. From Bernard's view, the most comprehensive theory, even if it is partial, remains suitable to guide research, but only for as long as it can be readjusted by a novel empirical finding. It might even be that a theoretical approach is erroneous as long as it serves to frame and give shape to novel empirical approaches. Bernard considered its use appropriate. As Henri Bergson has aptly put it, the scientific analysis becomes a conversation between the scientist and nature, which might at times take turns which are not foreseeable, but are central for science to progress as they force us to pose new questions. I will now try to illustrate some properties of the concept of plasticity that I consider relevant in capturing the empirical richness of neurobiological research. As a former neurobiologist, I was well accustomed to the ubiquitous use of plasticity in neurobiological publications. But only when I began my analytical work on the concept of plasticity, I became fully aware of the vastness, or in other words, the vagueness of the concept. Its use in current neurobiological research remains extremely general, as indicated by this quote. So you probably all know Eric Kandel, who was very important in forming also ideas about plasticity. And he says, it is this potential for plasticity of the relatively stereotyped units of the nervous system that endows each of us with our individuality. So he presents one very general interpretation, a very relevant one in this short quote. But the same author would, for example, in his publications, use plasticity in a very specific sense to describe molecular changes at the synapse, for example, at the contact points between neurons. So this concept carries from a very general statement all the way down to a very specific empirical description. So what to make out of plasticity? Where to put it in the development of the understanding of the nervous system? Not to get right away lost in the broad spectrum of empirical and theoretical explorations framed by plasticity, I started out by analyzing the understanding of plasticity in one well-circumscribed field of neurobiology, namely adult neurogenesis. This field is concerned with the formation and functional integration of novel neurons in the adult brain. As I investigated in detail how adult neurogenesis changed from a finding that was more or less ignored, a neglected finding you might call it, in the 1960s, to the focus of a very active and rapidly growing dynamic research field in the 90s, of the last century, I became increasingly curious to understand the role of plasticity in neurobiology in a more general manner. In this context, I came across the work of Staffan Müller-Wille and Hans-Jörg Reinberger, who have analyzed the broad spectrum of empirical enterprises that were framed by the concept of the gene during the 20th century, and they've done this in very great detail. And their historical work led the authors to conclude that the gene represents a concept in flux. This means it permits differential interpretation, and with that, scientific progress, not by providing a concise definition, but ways to think and experiment upon living processes, as captured by these concluding remarks of their entry on the gene in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I find the agreement with Claude Bernard's view rather striking. expressed in this quote. So the authors conclude it is the empirical success that decides upon the fate of a concept. The message is that complex objects of investigation, such as organisms, cannot be successfully understood by a single best account or description, and that any experimentally proceeding science is basically advancing through the construction of successful but always partial models. Whether and how long these models will continue to be gene-based remains an open question. Any answers to that question will be contingent on future research results, not on an ontology of life. And now I will come back to plasticity, using this idea. As in the case of the gene, one can witness how during the 20th century plasticity has been interpreted in different manners, but always in relation to specific empirical advances. In the following, I will briefly mention 3 examples that I've selected from neurobiological research to demonstrate the fluidity of the concept of plasticity, namely synaptic plasticity, adult neurogenesis, and plasticity of the spinal cord. This choice remains somewhat arbitrary and surely also superficial, as I can only outline it, as plasticity is used in a number or is central to a wide range of empirical contexts. However, these examples are first of all intended to outline the breadth of the concept of plasticity in a brief manner, in empirical and theoretical terms. In neurobiology of the 20th century, one very important articulation of the concept of plasticity has been made in relation to the adaptive changes of contacts between neurons, so-called synapses. The theoretical work of Donald Hebb and Jerzy Konorski in the 1940s provided a framework to explore how the properties of synapses may be changed due to specific inputs to neuronal networks. The experimental work guided by their proposals has provided important insights into how neuronal networks acquire and retain specific information through changes in the properties of synapses. Very generally speaking, synaptic plasticity refers to a relatively stable network whose adaptability is mainly limited to the contacts between its units, the neurons. Important here was that it was possible to devise experimental models that proved these changes first in invertebrates and then also in more highly developed organisms like mammals. Now to adult neurogenesis, another articulation of plasticity already mentioned. Here, the functional integration of novel neurons in existing networks in the mature nervous system is the question. And with the prominent rise of this field in the 1990s, it became generally accepted that adaptation in the adult brain is not limited to changing the properties of networks, but comprises what might be called the integration of novel network units, namely neurons. In contrast to synaptic plasticity, which is understood as an ubiquitous form of adaptation occurring in all parts of the nervous system, adult neurogenesis is thought to be limited to specific regions of the brain. We will hear about the exciting insights gained on the role of these novel neurons in the olfactory system tomorrow by Pierre-Marie Liédot. So this takes plasticity one step further, and now the third term that I choose, or the third field, it's more or less the plasticity of the spinal cord, refers very generally to the regenerative capacity of spinal cord tissue after an injury has occurred. One central factor here seems to be the formation of novel connections between neurons after the lesion. Relatively recent findings indicate that in the adult nervous system, a partial recovery of specific functions might be explained by the de novo formation of connections between existing neurons, which are adapted to the lesion situation, so really regarding the novel architecture that exists. With these very brief excursions into the empirical exploration of plasticity, I would like to point out that the concept is used in an increasing range of contexts and at the same time is becoming ever more central to the understanding of the nervous system. Another way to describe this is by showing how the number of publications have increased over the past years which refer to these different explorations of plasticity. I have just mentioned these 3 examples, and as a general reference, I've used in this graph the keyword nervous system, just to show the overall growth of the field. But you can see that all of these 3 explorations are reflected in quite an increase of publications. What this graph does not show is that the establishments of some of these understandings have engendered more resistance than others. In the case of adult neurogenesis, there was and still is a controversy in respect to the occurrence of this form of adaptation in different parts of the adult brain. In contrast, the findings that neuronal connections are formed in the spinal cord, considered unchangeable or hardwired for practically all of the 20th century, that these novel connections are possible, as I already referred to and are there to meet novel functional demands created through the lesion, has engendered much less controversy. This in spite of the fact that from an epistemological point of view, they might be considered just as revolutionary. One explanation is that these different forms of plasticity co-evolve and in their entirety render the capacity of change and adaptation ever more plausible. So you can say people who propelled the idea of adult neurogenesis in a way paved the way for the acceptance of an also malleable spinal cord. Another factor might be that in our self-understanding as humans, the plasticity of spinal cord tissue is less of relevance, as it only concerns the connection between le cerveau et les pattes. In contrast, the debates on the extent of adult neurogenesis in the brain touches on questions in which way our individual identity is correlated with our more or less changeable neuronal nature. In any case, I think it is not exaggerated to state that more recently an understanding of an adaptable nervous system has begun to pervade almost all of neurobiological research. A reflection of this is that plasticity has become associated with many different empirical contexts. I already mentioned that. So some researchers in neurobiology consider it a meaningless term. I would agree with them, saying that if you look for one precise and unifying definition of plasticity, you will be thoroughly disappointed by its vagueness that I mentioned in the beginning. However, if you consider the different fields that have blossomed under the umbrella of plasticity that are reinforcing the view of a dynamic adult nervous system undergoing functional and structural changes lifelong, you might consider it not as a useless term, but as a concept that inspires and provides a range of different empirical approaches. And with that, a novel way of experimenting and thinking about the nervous system. So I would like to conclude this part of my presentation by proposing that a continuing genealogy of weak concepts or general ideas capturing as much as possible a refined understanding of life dynamics is a central requisite for the advance of biological research during Claude Bernard's time as much as it is today. And the continuous referral to his work indicates to me his central role in establishing this relationship. This brings me to the second subject, which I would like to discuss. How is it possible to conceive of the particular properties of the adult organism? What has rendered the milieu intérieur and plasticity successful as biological concepts in this respect? What can we learn from the beautiful term embryogenesis silencieuse, which Alain Prochiantz suggested to me as a theme for this talk? So going back to Claude Bernard, one of his central contributions was to design une physiologie physiologique. I think also this I took from Alain's book. This design became possible because Claude Bernard initiated and pursued an experimental instead of an observational approach, combining knowledge from different scientific fields or disciplines available to him at his period. Decisive was that Claude Bernard did not give one of the disciplines that he needed to advance the understanding of the living a predominant role in his analysis. Instead, he combined as much empirical insight as possible to describe what he understood as the continuing dynamics of the living and with that, the particularity of life. As Georges Canguilhem has pointed out, Claude Bernard adapted his way of experimenting to the specific quality of his object of investigation. Again, a very central contribution to the advancement of physiology. And the same point I consider a very interesting intersection with today's understanding of the nature of the nervous system as it is captured by plasticity. I consider it central to both concepts that they permit to conceive of the inherently dynamic nature of biological processes. The biological processes underlying body physiology in general, as well as the functioning of the nervous system in particular, are in constant and reciprocal relationship with changing external conditions. It is a dynamic stability of the individual organism that derives its constancy not from immutability, but from the ongoing adaptation and readaptation to external demands. In this respect, I consider the idea of a dynamically constituted milieu intérieur in a logical relationship with the idea of degeneration and regeneration being in a constant balance and constituting the very nature of life, as captured by this nice quote. I would like to argue that both concepts, embryogenesis silencieuse and plasticity, conceive of the adult organism not as resisting death while slowly degenerating, but as dynamic and changeable lifelong. This, to me, reflects a decisive difference between the understanding by Bernard, as captured in the aphorism "La vie c'est la mort, la vie c'est la création," and not l'ensemble de forces qui s'opposent à la mort, as introduced by Bichat. So I would like to take up this point from the work of Alain Prochiantz. However, I would like to say this is not meant to imply an endless regenerative potential residing within the adult organism. After all, we all age. Without doubt, there's also a decline of the capacity for adaptive change in the nervous system with advancing age. No neurobiologist would deny this. Importantly, however, it is the decline of a dynamic system that takes place. Implicit in this dynamic nature is a certain degree of reversibility, the possibility to change the development of the nervous system at any point, providing an appropriate input. The dynamic nature of the nervous system holds the promise that certain changes which have occurred with age, but also through disease or trauma, might be reversed to a certain degree given the appropriate therapeutic interventions. I consider this one important moment for the success of plasticity in today's neurobiological research, which receives societal recognition and an important part of its funding through the promise of providing novel therapeutic approaches. So now I would like to come to the end of my presentation. The adaptation of the nervous system to novel demands is considered as the result of different forms of functional and structural adaptations occurring in a highly orchestrated fashion within the nervous system. These adaptive processes involve different parts of the nervous system and comprise different functional and structural levels, a few of which I have already mentioned. And I consider the idea of multifactorial processes underlying a dynamic adaptation another decisive similarity between the concepts of plasticity and milieu intérieur. Much like the dynamic constitution of the milieu intérieur through the contribution of different metabolic processes, the dynamic processes within the nervous system are the result of multiple changes. However, as is the case for the concept of the gene, it remains an open question if these different explorations of the dynamic nature of the nervous system will combine into one comprehensive understanding represented by one plasticity, or if the empirical advances will require a host of concepts, each adapted to the particular processes being analyzed. As Bergson put it at the occasion of the centenaire of Claude Bernard, his contribution was to define a science of the living and not of life. We heard this in French this morning. Thereby, I think he paved the way for us to seek and answer these type of questions. Thank you very much.